Good to see everyone. Thanks, Pastor Steve, Pastor Ben. It's always encouraging to see how God works through different churches and different cultures reaching the nations for Jesus Christ. I'm here to share about, I currently serve as a senior pastor of New Life Pres, and here to share, at least in my small circle, the potential of serving in a first, second generation Korean American church. And one of the things I want to start off is by saying that hopefully a blessing that you'll experience is that the potentials that you see here have different models. So that one of the models potentially that you'll see is that there's a togetherness. And so the analogy I like to use is that one potential model is going to be a three-legged race. 2 or 3 people connected and tied at the leg. And so they value togetherness, they value multicultural ethnicities, they value a community, perhaps at the expense of efficiency, of vision, of policy and procedures. At New Life Pres, and what I'm going to venture out to say is that my guess is that most second-generation Korean Americans are not really a three-legged race, per se. I think our analogy is more a relay race. So at New Life Pres, we are thankful for the first gen, but we take that baton and we want to run with it, still connected to some degree, but to cast our own vision, pursue a vision that God has given us. So here's the potential of what an immigrant church looks like in a relay race. And I'm going to share specifically about second generation Korean Americans and somewhat of a reformed, conservatively, theologically conservative circle, because that's my lane, that's my church. And so that's the audience that I'm speaking about. And so when you think about potentials, there's a telescopic view to say, 1,000 or a mile view. One way to think about the potential of a second generation Korean American church is to realize that the potential has already been actualized. So if you go on a broad perspective and look at every second generation Korean American pastor, youth group, seminarian, and church, I strongly believe that we only exist and are able to have experience and to grow as a leader because of what the first generation has already done. So we come on we ride on their tailcoats, their coattails. So the potential has already been actualized on some levels. So when you look out, we have to be here or be thankful that we are here because of them. So the potential has been actualized in that sense, from developing leaders, churches, denominational leaders, EMs that became independent. So all of that, I think, has already been a fruitful and potential that has been actualized right now as of today. So I'm thankful for the first gen and for the KM pastors that have led and pioneered the way for us. But moving along, aside from the telescopic view, the potential that we have at New Life Pres, which is just our world and circle, are along 2 lines. One, I do feel that when we talk about potentials, there is a distinction to know that potential is very different from 2 other aspects in this process. One is that potential is not talking about assessment, because you have to do assessment of yourself, your giftedness, the church, a lot of what Pastor Steve has shared, the power dynamics, the financial health of your organization. So potential is different from assessment. Potential is also different from implementation. So we could show you what the potential may be, but you have to assess your church and yourself, and then you got to figure out the strategic plan to implement that. So we're just kind of giving you a picture of what, by God's grace, this potential could be as a fruit and a product and as an end game. And there are 2 areas. One, I think there is a potential that for you on a personal level, so that you have the chance to steward the gifts that maybe God has uniquely gifted you to be gifted with. Pursue a vision, cast a vision, create a culture for yourself, carry the weight and the burdens and the stress of being the lead pastor, calling the shot, preaching every week, thinking about finances, leading your elder board, the diaconate board, and your staff, ministering to people, organizing and leading your church to navigate church-size dynamics. So there's the potential there on an individual level to be a good steward of the gifts God has given you and to become fully the leader that maybe God has called you to be. I think that it will look very different if you are connected to the immigrant church. Not worse or better, but just different. So when I take the baton, I feel that where I am today is very different than where I would have been if we were still a typical KME model, because there's not an opportunity to lead a session and to be able to cast your own vision, think about your own logo, and to develop as a follower of Jesus Christ and a pastor. So on the individual level, you have the potential to quote unquote maximize your gift as a lead pastor. So that's a personal level of the potential that you have. The other potential is going to be, which I think is probably more important, is the church potential and how do you reach people. So there's a distinction that we have to keep in mind that potential is very different from preferences. So if you're thinking as a second gen or even a Chinese like second or third gen pastor, and you're thinking potential is going to be getting away from your preferences, then that's a little bit different when you think about church. So for myself, if I'm thinking the potential of becoming, serving immigrant churches, that I could get away from morning prayer, that I could get away from no office hours and I could just go work at a cafe. No more Korean food and Korean smells. No more of a building that has Korean letters. No more church fan that has Korean letters on this. No more joint services where they do the songs in both Korean and English, and the English always has spelling errors and the Korean doesn't. No, we're not trying to, if that's what no more bowing, We don't want as much of a vertical relationship, we want more of a horizontal. So I think those are understandable, but if that's what you're thinking about your potential, then I think it's a very low view. And by the way, the first gen has they have frustrations with me. With second gen, especially, for those who are bordering line on millennials. First gen, they have a good point. They're like, they have complaints about us if we're talking about preferences. We talk about money too much. We hide behind our families too much. We think we're going to engage the culture by working at Starbucks, but we're not really working. We think too much about salaries, and we view a pastor's calling more as a job than actually a calling. So I think, and then if we're really harsh about it, they're like, most second gen, they're not that gifted. You can't get a senior job at a non-Asian church. You're going to try to church plant, it's not going to go anywhere. And so you never experienced the fullness of the spirit in which people were gathered in. So I just want to say that your potential can't be really getting away from preferences. And there are challenges on both ends between first and second gen. But this is what the potential could be. You could be uniquely gifted and positioned as a church to be able to reach nominal, de-churched, unchurched people and disciple them for the nations. And to Pastor Steve's point, I think that one of the potentials at New Life Pres is that we are able to be better equipped, better postured and positioned in order to reach the demographic and niche that we feel we are called to reach with Reformed theology. And I honestly believe that. And that's what it's been like since we became independent in 2018. What is that demographic? Well, I'll be honest about that. A person who wants to go to Saddleback may not like our church. Person who wants to go to an inner city church that deals with systemic injustice and racism, probably not going to like our church as much. Because if you try to be a church for everyone, you'll end up being a church for no one. Every church is uniquely cultured and has a distinct DNA that could allow them to be postured and positioned to reach a demographic that they're called to reach. So what is New Life Pres called to reach? Our target audience are the upper middle class soccer moms. We are those who want to live in Irvine. Our target audience that we're discipling are the same people that Tesla is marketing their cars to. Educated, upper middle class, high expectations, critical, we idolize our kids, we're tiger moms. That's who comes through our doors for the most part. And I'm like, we embrace this because the gospel is needed just as much in that demographic, because success and power and achievement is just as deep and in some ways harder to be able to penetrate by the Spirit, because comfort and materialism are really strong idols. But I believe since we became independent but still connected to the KM, we have been better postured and better positioned and equipped to reach the people that we feel God has uniquely called us to reach. The Tesla soccer mom. That is our vision. But that's what upper middle class and educated, that's what our church is about. And I'll end on this before we get Daniel Lowe up here. One of the biggest arguments or biggest potential arguments between a KM, EM is what do you do with the church building? And I'm thankful for Pastor Samuel, who is the KM senior pastor. We have a great relationship. You have to cultivate that. That's part of the assessment or implementation. How do you implement this? You got to cultivate that relationship. But right now, this building that we share, we're completely two independent churches. We have different governing boards, different nonprofit status. We don't have any meetings, joint services. We don't have anything officially together. Pastor Samuel and I, we have lunch, we'll talk, we'll pray. So it's based on that relationship alone. By their grace to us, we are trying to work through the building right now in a way that they're thinking about the second, and I'm thinking about the third and fourth generation. The building is important, but it's not everything, but it's still important. And we're in the midst of trying to figure out a contractual arrangement with lawyers and real estate investors and bankers to figure out how can we have two legal entities with joint ownership of this building. And it's difficult, but we're almost there, knock on wood. Please don't share this. We don't want you to mess up the deal, but it's almost there. Yeah, so we have to draw up the contracts. What does the relationship look like? What is the joint ownership? You know, for example, if you're interested in this, we'll talk more. The three priorities that I had was like the ability to sell autonomously, because we don't necessarily want approval from the other side. And there's a reason for that, because when either of us get fired or if either senior pastor retires, then you get like as Pastor Steve, you could have another pharaoh come in that's gonna mess up the relationship. So the trigger clause to sell is important. The expenses of the building is important, but there's also the equity in the buildings that's important. So we had to prioritize that, and I prioritized the out clause first, as well as secondly, the equity in the building, and third is gonna be the expenses. Expenses monthly is not that as important as the other two. And the KM actually sees it very similarly. So we're in partnership, and this is something that I think could really be great for the future generations of the kingdom as we continue to reach upper middle class, Tesla, soccer moms. But those are the people that we're trying to love and trying to minister to. And that's one potential model that we have. With that said, I'm gonna hand it over to Daniel Lowe, and he's gonna finish this off.